All right, I'm going to tell you just at the outset, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to your calls today because I have a lot to say on this article that was published in USA Today by Kirsten Powers. The headline on this is Jim Crow Laws for Gays and Lesbians. I'm just going to dive right in and let you hear it for yourself. She says, what's the matter with Kansas? And she's referring to this bill that was to protect the religious freedom of businesses and individuals running these businesses to refuse services to same-sex couples. It had passed the state house. It was killed in the state senate. Similar bills, she notes, have cropped up in a half dozen states in an effort to protect anti-gay religious believers against lawsuits. Nice slam. A florist in Washington state, a Colorado baker, and a New Mexico photographer have been sued for refusing to serve gay couples getting married. They say to do so would be to celebrate nuptials at odds with their Christian faith. She says it's probably news to most married people that their florist and caterer were celebrating their wedding union. Most people think they just hired a vendor to provide a service. It's not clear why some Christian vendors are so confused about their role here. Whether Christians have the legal right to discriminate should be a moot point because Christianity doesn't prohibit serving a gay couple getting married. Whoa, we'll come back to that one. Jesus calls his followers to be servants to all, nor does the Bible call service to another an affirmation. And she quotes a liberal United Methodist pastor, Adam Hamilton, who says Jesus routinely healed, fed, and ministered to people whose personal lifestyle he likely disagreed with. Okay, right. But he didn't ever do that without a purpose, and the purpose was to call sinners to repentance. That was the purpose of Jesus being with sinners. It wasn't to affirm them in their sin or participate in their sin or materially support their sin. Anyway, she goes on to say, Christians backing this bill are essentially arguing for homosexual Jim Crow laws. That's what she thinks. If you actually think that there ought to be laws on the books to undergird your religious freedom as a Christian business owner, to refuse service, not to refuse service overall, but to refuse service when it is basically materially supporting a so-called homosexual wedding, then you are for homosexual Jim Crow laws. This has got to be the worst logic I've ever heard in my life. Now listen to this. Evangelical pastor Andy Stanley from North Point Community Church, the second largest church in the U.S., was also interviewed for this article that she wrote. He told me he finds it offensive that Christians would leverage faith to support the Kansas law. He said, quote, serving people we don't see eye to eye with is the essence of Christianity. Jesus died for a world with which he didn't see eye to eye. If a bakery doesn't want to sell its products to a gay couple, it's their business, literally. But leave Jesus out of it. Close quote. That's a pastor saying that. Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley. He said, unbelievable, leave Jesus out of it. I can't imagine a time any Christian would ever advise any other Christian to leave Jesus out of anything. But anyway, she goes on to say, Christians serve unrepentant murderers through prison ministry, so why can't they provide a service for a same-sex marriage? Well, Kirsten, here's the difference. Here's the difference. When a Christian goes into a prison to perform prison ministry, as I've done in my life, it's not to materially support a murder. It's to go with a mind towards sharing the gospel with these men and bringing them to repentance and praying for them and reading the Bible with them. It's a ministry. You're not affirming the crime at all. And in the case, for example, and I'll give this case because I interviewed that Oregon baker who ended up having to shutter his business altogether because of what was going on. And he said very, very clearly, I never refused service to homosexuals for the sake of being a homosexual. I sold things to them all the time, cookies and cakes, and provided services, was really nice to them. All I said was when this one couple came into my shop and said, could you make us a cake for our same-sex wedding? His response was, you know what, I don't really feel comfortable doing that because I'm a Christian and it's really not my thing. And then he gets sued and he ends up having to, shutter his business for that. You know what she says at the end of all this? Boy, some claim it's because marriage is so sacred, but double standards abound. Christian bakers don't interrogate wedding clients to make sure their behavior comports with the Bible. If they did, they'd be out of business. Stanley said, this pastor, Andy Stanley, Jesus taught that if a person is divorced and gets remarried, it's adultery. So if Christians don't have a problem doing business with people getting remarried, why refuse to do business with gays and lesbians? This is a pastor, and this is what Kirsten Powers says at the end. Maybe they should just ask themselves, what would Jesus do? I think he'd bake the cake. Kirsten Powers, you're blaspheming God for saying something like that. And we're going to come back right after this. Well, I know I'm not alone today in criticizing Kirsten Powers' article, saying basically if you want to support the religious freedom of Christian business owners from having to materially participate in a same-sex wedding, that is essentially bringing back Jim Crow laws. Now, very briefly, I just want to remind you the Jim Crow laws, as Wikipedia has pointed out, were all these racial segregation laws that went on between 1876 and 1965 and mandated de jure racial segregation in all public facilities in the southern states of the former Confederacy. And we had the whole separate but equal. And then we had all these court cases involved in this whole thing. But I think if you're going to compare this whole thing, there are so many different things that you can say. First of all, the Jim Crow laws were in direct violation of amendments to the Constitution that were already in place that had a very racial undergirding to them. Let's talk about the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. I mean, 1865 is when the 13th Amendment was actually ratified by 3/4 of the states, outlawing slavery. And then the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, secured the rights of former slaves, then branched off to include other groups. But the first section of the 14th Amendment says that anybody who is born in the United States is a citizen and should never be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law or deny anyone equal protection of the law. Jim Crow laws were in direct violation of, amendments to the Constitution that were already there. You don't have any amendment to the Constitution regarding same-sex marriage. If you want one, then go ahead and try to ratify one, and then we can have a discussion about it. But it's not there. I'll tell you what is an amendment to the Constitution, and that's the First Amendment, which guarantees that we have freedom of religion and we have freedom of conscience. And it's not the job of the state to tell people what their religious consciences are. Might I also point out that back in 2012, Kirsten Powers wrote an article slamming the decision by the Obama administration to put the HHS mandate inside Obamacare. And she said here, this is just amazing, the hypocrisy here. She says the administration claims its decision to force Catholic institutions to pay for insurance covering contraceptives is balanced. So why, when religious liberty was weighed against access to birth control, did freedom lose? It's hard to escape the feeling that the Obama administration is trying to run America's Catholic charities and institutions out of business. How else to explain the mean-spirited decision mandating that Catholic institutions be required to pay for health insurance that covers sterilization, contraceptives, and the morning after pill, which violates their fundamental religious beliefs? Now, let me ask you a question, Kirsten Powers, which is this. When pro-lifers and Christians have to pay money for abortion-inducing drugs through the HHS mandate, they're not doing abortions, are they? They're not in the operating room. They're not holding any materials. They're not dealing with the suction machine, are they? So what's wrong with it? You're just paying money for the HHS mandate. I mean, you're just doing what every good American citizen is having to do. You're not participating in an abortion. They're not making you get an abortion. They're not making you perform an abortion. So what is the problem? Well, on the issue of life, Kirsten Powers had a big problem with it because she understood that when you pay money that gives a woman a pill that will end the life of a child, that you are to some extent putting a moral stamp of approval on something that is morally reprehensible, right? She gets it when it comes to the issue of life, but when it comes to the issue of so-called same-sex marriage, she calls it Jim Crow laws to uphold religious freedom for individuals. And that is repulsive. It would be repulsive, I would think, to any African-American Christian, for sure, like Vodi Bakum, who's written great stuff on this. I'll get to that in a minute. But I put up a few questions for Kirsten Powers on this. Because if you're going to say that giving religious freedom, which is already guaranteed in the Constitution, to people who say, I don't want to do anything to contribute any of my business ownership or my goods and services or my work to support a so-called same-sex marriage because I'm morally and religiously opposed to it. That's not a Jim Crow law. And let me just say, part of the problem here is that she has bought into this idea that it's a perfect analogy. She has walked directly into the trap of the LGBT community, which is constantly saying the civil rights movement, what blacks went through in the 1960s and all the way back to the era of slavery, is completely analogous to what gays are going through today. Let me ask you a few questions here. When have American homosexuals ever been forced under U.S. law into physical slavery? When have American homosexuals ever been segregated and forced into gays-only bathrooms? When have American homosexuals ever been forced by law to sit in the back of buses like they were in Montgomery during the civil rights movement? When have American homosexuals ever been denied the right to life, liberty, or property under the law? When has any American homosexual ever been legally constituted as 3/5 of a person? When have American homosexuals ever been legally required to pay a poll tax? Where in the U.S. Constitution do homosexuals have formalized protection for homosexual behavior and so-called homosexual rights to marriage? And whoever argued in all of U.S. history that the condition of having black skin was an immoral condition, much less be able to justify such a bizarre viewpoint with a religious perspective? I just want to know. When did anybody ever make the argument, back when they were in the Jim Crow era, that being black was immoral? Not to my knowledge did anybody with half a brain ever say that. They were racists and they were wrong, and thank the Lord it was corrected over time. It took too long for us to correct it, but now we all look back on it and say no human being created in the image of God should be treated in a second-class way just because their skin is a different color. And this is probably why you have so many black pastors like Vodi Bakum who have said, don't compare a sin movement to what happened during the civil rights movement. It's not analogous. And Christians understand that. And I just think it's so irresponsible to say the sorts of things that Kirsten Powers was saying in this article because all of her premises are wrong. They're wrong. And plus, I just think it's incredibly hypocritical that she understands the HHS mandate is a violation of religious freedom, but she doesn't think that protecting the religious freedom of Christians is not important when it comes to this issue. Why? And I think what this is going to require is for her to think about this issue a whole lot more deeply than she has. I have no doubt that her intentions are probably good, but when it comes down to it, this is faulty reasoning. And Andy Stanley, who knows where he's coming from? That is just unacceptable. We'll come back. I have more to say right after this. Well, I'm isolating this one line from Kirsten Powers' USA Today article, Jim Crow laws for gays and lesbians, basically saying that because the Bible doesn't explicitly prohibit serving a gay couple getting married with a wedding cake, that you don't have any right to say that, you know, you can discriminate based on your religious freedom. First of all, Kirsten, it's not up to the state to decide what Christianity is or is not. It's the state's job to get out of the way. We have a separation of church and state, don't we? They love saying that on the left. Stay out of it. Stay out of it. And by the way, the Bible also has nothing to say about what Christianity has to say about the HHS mandate. So, you know, you have to think a little bit more deeply than that. I want to get to this other thing, too, because as Andy Stanley was being quoted in this article as saying, leave Jesus out of it. He had made this comment that Jesus taught that if a person is divorced and gets remarried, it's adultery. So if Christians don't have a problem doing business with people getting remarried, why refuse to do business with gays and lesbians? Well, here he was back in 2012, coming under fire at the time for preaching a sermon where he talked about having to discipline a gay couple serving in leadership at one of the campuses there at North Point, not for homosexuality, but for adultery. Remember this?
She said they were going to Buckhead Church. She said, and then she kind of chuckled. And she said, not only that, they're serving. I said, really? She goes, yeah, they joined a host team. Now, what I knew, and I double-checked with her to make sure I was correct, was the last where we had left off was he, my friend's partner, and he's a friend now, but back then not so much, my friend's partner was still married. And so I said to her, I said, now, he's still married, right? And she said, yeah, the divorce is taking longer than they expected. It's kind of getting dragged out. So I called my buddy and said, okay, I know things have been awkward, between us, but look, and I'm glad you're in church. That's a good thing. And I'm glad you're at one of our churches. That's a good thing. But your partner, he's still married. So see, this is just good old fashioned adultery. Like you're in a sexual relationship with someone else's husband. So you can't be on a guest services team. Okay. You're just living in, this is clear. Okay.
Do you catch that? So the problem there in that example was not that he had a gay couple, an openly gay couple serving, but the fact that one of the men was still married. The adultery bothered him, but the homosexuality apparently didn't bother him a whole lot at all. And then he says in the Kirsten Powers article, leave Jesus out of it. We're not going to leave Jesus out of it. And it never has been about discrimination or being nasty or being horrible or anything else. It's about the First Amendment. That's all it's about. And if you have a conviction that you don't want to materially participate in something that is uneasy for your conscience, you shouldn't have the state forcing you to do it. That's the principle. And I think that this article was ill-conceived, ill-reasoned, and ill-argued. And that's what I think.